I'm going to tell you about a morning in July when the sun came up over the Kansas prairie like it had something to prove. And a woman named Ruth McAllister sat on a wagon bench in front of a stranger's gate with a sleeping child tucked under each arm, and no plan left in her bones except to wait. She had been sitting there since the night before. The mule had stopped complaining around midnight, which meant it had given up on anything changing, and Ruth had stopped hoping around the same time, because hoping had cost her more than she could afford. The younger one, Annie, had fallen asleep against her side about an hour after they stopped, her breath thin and ragged in the way that had been worrying Ruth for 2 states now. The older one, Eli, had stayed awake until the sky started to gray, and then his head had dropped onto her shoulder, and he was gone too. So when Seth Calloway stepped onto his porch at 5 in the morning to face another day of cold coffee and stale biscuits, the first thing he saw was a woman and 2 children sitting in front of his gate like they'd grown there overnight. He stood still for a long moment, letting the surprise settle. Then he walked down the steps and across the yard, his boots crunching in the dry dirt, and when he reached the gate, he stopped and looked at her face. She looked back at him. Her eyes were the color of good soil, and there was something in them that had been so worn down by waiting that it had taken on a kind of shine, the kind of shine you only get when everything else has been rubbed away. Before we go any further into Ruth McAllister's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me what city you're watching from today. Drop it in the comments. I want to see this story spread across every corner of this country because Ruth's story is not just hers. It belongs to every woman who ever had to choose between pride and survival, and every child who ever looked at a stranger's face and tried to decide whether to trust it. Now settle in, partner. This one is going to run deep. Seth Calloway reached up and unlatched the gate himself. He didn't ask questions first. He didn't demand explanations. He just swung the gate open and said, "Come inside." "Coffee's not made yet, but the well's cold." Ruth looked at him for a heartbeat, measuring the offer for traps the way a woman learns to do when every kindness she's ever received has come with a price attached. Then she climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, lifted Annie into her arms in one practiced motion, and said, "I'm Ruth McAllister. This is Eli, and this is Annie." "Seth Calloway," he said, "let's get out of the sun." He turned and walked toward the house, trusting that she would follow. She did. Inside, the kitchen was a testament to years of a man cooking to survive rather than to eat. The stove was cold, the flour tin sat crooked on the shelf, the empty pot hung on the wrong hook. Ruth took it all in without comment because she had long ago learned that a woman who judges a man's kitchen before she's been hired doesn't stay hired. Seth pumped water into the basin and set a tin cup on the table. "Drink," he said to Eli. The boy looked at his mother. Ruth gave the smallest nod. Eli drank, and then he drank again, because he had been thirsty for longer than he wanted to admit. Seth pumped a second cup and set it near Ruth. She wrapped both hands around it and let the warmth seep into her fingers. "You cook?" Seth asked. "Yes, sir." "What can you make?" Ruth looked at his kitchen again, this time with a different eye. "What do you have?" "Salt pork, flour, dried beans, some eggs out back, half a side of bacon." "Then I can make you breakfast." Seth crossed his arms. "I haven't said you have the job yet." "No," Ruth agreed, "but I can cook you breakfast while we talk about it." He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. She didn't smile to soften the offer. She just waited with that quiet steadiness that he was starting to understand wasn't stubbornness. It was the last thing she had left, and she was holding on to it with both hands. "All right," he said. She was at the stove before he finished the word. She worked without asking where anything was, opening doors until she found what she needed, moving things to where they made sense, finding the salt by smell. She had the stove lit in under 3 minutes. Eli watched his mother, the way a boy watches when he has done it 1,000 times, which Seth understood meant that he had, in fact, done it 1,000 times. Watched her work while he tried to figure out how to make himself useful, and came up short. Seth sat down at the table. "McAllister," he said, "you from around here?" "Missouri, originally." Ruth cracked 4 eggs into the pan without looking at him. We've been moving west. Husband? Her hand didn't stop moving. Past last winter. I'm sorry. He turned the tin cup in his hands. He glanced at Eli, who was now sitting on the bench near his sister, quiet, watching. How old's the boy? 12. He work? Eli straightened up before Ruth could answer. Yes, sir. I can do anything you need doing. Seth looked at the boy. Eli had the same straight spine as his mother, and the same eyes that didn't beg. He'd been told no enough times to know how, and it hadn't broken him yet. We'll see, Seth said. The breakfast Ruth McAllister made that morning from the wreckage of his neglected kitchen was the best thing Seth Calloway had eaten in 4 years. The biscuits were light and hot, and she'd found the butter he'd forgotten was in the cold box. The eggs were cooked the right way, crisp at the edges, soft in the center. And she'd rendered the salt pork until it curled perfect and stopped at exactly the right moment before it went to leather. He ate everything on his plate. Then he looked up, and she was watching him from across the table, both hands around her coffee cup, waiting. You've done this before, he said. Kept a kitchen for 12 years. For how many people? Husband and 2 children. A pause that had weight in it. And whoever else came through. Seth set his fork down. I'll be straight with you, Mrs. McAllister. I posted for a cook, 1 person. I've got 2 hired men sleeping in the bunkhouse, and I'm the only one in the main house. It's not a big operation. I understand. What I'm saying is, I don't have a family situation set up here. There's no school in riding distance. There's no neighbors close. It's just work and a hot Kansas summer. Ruth put her cup down. Mr. Calloway, I want to be straight with you too. Go ahead. I have $11 to my name. We've been on the road for 40 days. Annie's had a cough that isn't going away because she needs better food and a dry place to sleep. And Eli, her voice didn't break. She didn't let it. Eli hasn't said a whole sentence to anyone other than me in 3 weeks, because every time we stop somewhere, we end up moving on again, and he stopped seeing the point in talking to people. Eli didn't look up, but his shoulders tightened just slightly. So, I'm not asking you for charity, Ruth said. I'm asking you for the job you posted. I'll cook 3 meals a day and keep your kitchen and your house clean. And I'll do it well. I only ask that the children have a dry place to sleep and that we're not treated like a problem you need to solve. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Seth's hired man Jake was moving around in the yard, boots crunching in the dry dirt. Somewhere behind the house, a rooster decided it was time. The air coming through the window was already warm. Seth looked at the little girl asleep on the bench. Annie, still curled the same way she'd been when Ruth carried her in. Her breathing was audible, a little too thick at the bottom of each exhale. He looked at Eli, who was still pretending not to be listening. He looked at Ruth, who was sitting with her spine straight and her eyes clear and not asking him for anything except the truth. He stood up. There's a room off the kitchen. Used to be the housekeeper's room. 2 beds. You and the girl take it. The boy can have the small room at the end of the hall. Used to be a storage room, but there's a cot in it that's serviceable. He pushed his chair in. Wages are $12 a month, plus room and board. You cook 3 meals. You keep the kitchen and the main room. The rest of the house is mine, and I'll see to it myself. Ruth stood. That's fair. Good. He picked up his hat. I'll tell Jake there'll be more at the table for meals. He won't complain. He hasn't had a hot lunch in 6 months. He was at the door when Ruth said, Mr. Calloway. He looked back. Why? She asked. Why what? Why are you saying yes? She wasn't suspicious exactly, just careful. You looked at us at the gate and you could have kept walking. Most men would have. Seth thought about that. He turned his hat in his hands once. I had a sister, he said finally. Sat outside a man's gate once and waited too long to knock. He looked at the window. Shouldn't have waited. He went outside. Ruth stood in his kitchen for a moment alone and let out a long, slow breath she'd been holding since somewhere around the Missouri border. Then she started washing the breakfast dishes. By noon, she had found everything in the kitchen that had been put in the wrong place and fixed it. By mid-afternoon, she had made a list on the back of an envelope of things that would need to come from town. She had put Annie down for a proper sleep in the cool of the back room and given her a dose of the dried thyme tea she'd been rationing since St. Joseph. And Eli, without being asked, had gone outside and found Jake, and the 2 of them were moving fence posts in the east field. Seth saw it when he rode back from checking the far pasture. He stopped his horse and watched for a moment. Eli taking direction from Jake without resentment. Actually working, sweat on his face. Looking for the first time in a long while like a 12-year-old boy with a task in front of him instead of a weight. Seth rode on without saying anything about it. That evening at supper, Ruth put food on the table that made Jake go silent mid-sentence. He'd been telling a story about a horse that got loose near Salina, and he simply stopped, looked at the plate in front of him, and forgot what he'd been saying. He didn't remember until he'd eaten everything on it. "Lord Almighty," Jake said, setting his fork down with the reverence of a man in church. "Mrs. McAllister, where have you been?" "Missouri," Ruth said. "Well, Missouri doesn't know what it lost." He looked at Seth. "Boss, I hope you're paying this woman right." Seth looked at his own empty plate. "Working on it," he said. Eli ate with his head down, but he was eating, which was more than Ruth had managed to get him to do in 3 days. Annie sat beside her mother and methodically worked through everything on her plate, and then looked hopefully at the pot still on the stove. "May I have more?" Annie asked Seth, because he was the one sitting nearest the stove. He looked at her. She looked back with the total unguarded honesty of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned that wanting things out loud was dangerous. He got up, ladled more beans into her bowl, and set it back in front of her without comment. "Thank you," Annie said. "Mm-hmm," Seth said, and sat back down. Ruth watched all of this from her end of the table and didn't say anything, but something shifted in her expression. Not quite warmth yet, not enough trust built for that, but recognition, the kind a person feels when something happens the way it was supposed to, and they'd forgotten that was possible. After supper, after Jake had gone back to the bunkhouse and the children were settling in for the night, Seth sat on the front porch, with the last of the day's heat rolling off the flatland, and Ruth came out and stood at the porch rail. "I didn't thank you properly," she said. "You made supper," Seth said. "That's thanks enough." She was quiet a moment. "It's not just supper, I mean—" He looked at her sideways. "When you let us through that gate this morning," she said, "it had been 40 days since anyone did that without making me feel like I owed them something I wasn't willing to pay." Seth didn't answer right away. He looked out at the dark field where the fireflies were coming up out of the grass, slow and steady. "You don't owe me anything but what we agreed," he said finally. "That's what a fair arrangement means." Ruth's hands rested on the porch rail. "Not everyone thinks that." "I know." His voice was flat. "That's their problem, not mine." She almost smiled. It was small and quick, the kind that came and went before a person could decide if they meant it. "I'll have breakfast ready before 5. I'm up by 4:30. Then breakfast will be ready at 4:30. She went inside. Seth stayed on the porch a while longer, listening to the night settle, and thought about his sister, and about the way some things broke clean and some things didn't, and about the fact that for the first time in 4 years there were voices in his house that weren't his and Jake's, and that it didn't feel wrong. That surprised him more than he expected. He hadn't planned on being surprised by anything, but the next morning when he came in from the barn at 4:28 and found the stove lit and coffee already on, and Ruth standing at the counter in the gray early light, sleeves rolled up, moving with the quiet confidence of a woman who had decided where she stood and intended to stay there, Seth Calloway walked to the table, pulled out his chair, and sat down. And somewhere between the smell of the coffee and the sound of a child's footsteps in the hall, he stopped feeling quite so much like the last person left in a house that had forgotten what it was built for. 40 miles to the east, in a roadside town that had never heard of Northridge Ranch, a man nobody in Harlan's Crossing had ever seen was asking questions about a woman traveling west with 2 children. He said he was kin. He said he just wanted to help. But the man who heard him said later that there was something in his eyes that didn't match what his mouth was saying. The way a man looks when he isn't finding something, but hunting it. And the road to Harlan's Crossing ran straight and flat under a July sky, with no shade and no mercy, and nothing to slow a man down who had already made up his mind. The letter came on a Thursday, slipped under the kitchen door, sometime before dawn by a rider who didn't bother to announce himself. Ruth found it when she came in to light the stove. A square envelope lying on the floorboards, like something that had been left behind rather than delivered. She picked it up and knew the handwriting before she read the return address. The same hand that had written the letters in Missouri, the ones she had burned one by one in the cook stove before leaving, because she couldn't bear to keep them and couldn't bear to leave them for someone else to find. Carter McAllister had found her. She stood in the gray early light with the envelope in her hands and did not open it immediately. She set it on the counter and lit the stove first, because the children needed breakfast and the day needed to start, regardless of what words were waiting inside that paper. She put the coffee on and measured the flour, and only when the kitchen had begun to warm and the familiar rhythm of morning had steadied her hands did she take the letter to the window where the light was better and break the seal. Carter's handwriting was careful, the kind of careful that came from a man who believed appearances were a form of currency. He wrote that he had learned of Bernard's passing and that his heart grieved for her loss. He wrote that family was everything and that the McAllister name carried obligations that could not be set aside by distance. He wrote that he had made inquiries and understood she was living in reduced circumstances, working as a domestic for a man she had no connection to, and that this was not a fitting situation for Bernard's children. He wrote that he was prepared to offer her a reasonable settlement and a position in his household in St. Joseph, where the children could be raised properly among their own kin. He wrote that if she refused, he would be forced to petition the courts in Missouri for custody, as the welfare of the children was his paramount concern. Ruth read it through once standing at the window. Then she read it a second time sitting at the table. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and slipped it back into the envelope and placed it in her apron pocket. She finished making breakfast. She called the children in from the yard where they had been feeding scraps to the barn cats. She served Seth his coffee and his eggs and his biscuits, and she sat down across from him and said nothing. But Seth Calloway had been reading people long enough to know when something had shifted in the air of a room. He finished his breakfast without comment, helped Eli with a question about the horses, and waited until the children had left the table and Ruth was standing at the sink with her back to him. Then he said, "What did the letter say?" Ruth's hand stilled in the dishwater. She did not turn around. "How did you know there was a letter?" "I saw you take it from the window. Saw the look on your face before you put it away." She dried her hand slowly and turned. She took the envelope from her apron and set it on the table in front of him. "Carter McAllister, my husband's brother." Seth did not pick it up. "What does he want?" "He wants the children. He says he'll take me to court if I don't give them up voluntarily." Seth looked at the envelope, then at her face. "Can he do that?" "I don't know." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that had not been there before. A thread pulled tight, ready to snap. In Missouri, he had money and he had friends. He had a judge who owed him favors. I left because I knew I couldn't win a legal fight there. But Kansas is different, I think. I hope. She pressed her palms flat against the table. "I don't know the law here. I don't know anyone here except you and Jake, and the people in town who still look at me like I'm something that washed up on their doorstep." Seth was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, Eli's voice carried faintly as he called something to Annie. The sounds of ordinary life pressing against an extraordinary moment. "What do you need?" Seth asked. Ruth looked up at him. "I need to know if there's a lawyer in Wichita who can tell me what my rights are. I need to know if Carter can reach across a state line and take what's mine. I need a piece of paper that says I'm not a runaway woman with nothing to stand on." Seth nodded once. "I know a man in Dodge City, used to be a lawyer before he went into cattle. He'll know someone in Wichita who's good. How soon can you send word?" "Today. I'll ride to town myself." Ruth's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the smallest release of tension. "I can't pay you back for this. Not yet." "I didn't ask you to." "That doesn't mean I won't." Seth looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "I know it doesn't." He stood and reached for his hat, and Ruth watched him go with the letter still lying on the table between them, a shadow that had followed her across the Missouri line and found her even here, even in this quiet kitchen with its warm stove and its smell of bread rising. Seth rode to Harlan's Crossing that morning and sent the first telegram to an old contact in Dodge City, a man named Ezra Finch, who had once been a lawyer and still knew how to find the ones who were worth their fee. Then he rode back to the ranch and told Ruth that the message was on its way and that she should expect an answer within 3 days. Those 3 days stretched like wire. Ruth went about her work with the same steady competence she had shown from the first morning. But there was a new vigilance in her movements, a way of checking the road from the kitchen window, of listening for hooves that did not belong. Eli felt it without understanding it, and he became quieter, more watchful himself. Annie, too young to read the undercurrents, asked questions about whether they would stay here forever, and Ruth answered with a brightness that cost her more than Annie could know. On the second day, Seth found Eli sitting alone on the fence rail behind the barn, staring at nothing. He walked over and leaned against the fence beside him, not speaking. After a long silence, Eli said, "Is he coming here?" Seth did not pretend not to understand. "I don't know, but if he does, we'll be ready." "How?" Seth considered the question. "The same way you get ready for anything. You make sure you know what you're standing on, and you don't back down from it." Eli looked at him with those eyes that had seen too much for a boy his age. "My father used to say that, before he started drinking. He said a man's word was his bond. Then he broke it so many times I stopped counting." Seth said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not your father." "I know." Eli's voice was quiet. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." They stood together in the Kansas afternoon, a man and a boy, neither of them sure what the other needed, both of them trying to find their way toward something that looked like trust. The telegram arrived on the third day, delivered by a rider from town who handed it to Seth at the gate and rode off without waiting. Seth read it standing in the yard, then walked to the house and handed it to Ruth. It was from Douglas Hale, a lawyer in Wichita that Ezra Finch had recommended. The telegram was short and professional. It confirmed that as a widowed mother in gainful employment with documented housing and no record of neglect, Ruth McAllister held strong legal standing under Kansas law. Carter McAllister's claim would require proof of inability to provide or evidence of immoral conduct, neither of which he could produce from across state lines. The telegram ended with an offer to represent her if needed, and a request for a formal statement of her employment and living situation, signed and witnessed, to establish a paper trail. Ruth read it 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket beside Carter's letter. 2 pieces of paper that together formed a kind of battle line. "He says I need a statement," she said, "signed and witnessed, about where I'm living and working." "I'll sign it," Seth said. "Jake will too." "Will that be enough?" "It'll be a start." Ruth looked at him, and for a moment the mask she wore slipped, and he saw the exhaustion underneath. Not the exhaustion of a single day's work, but the exhaustion of years of holding things together that should never have been asked to hold. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. Seth nodded. "Supper's in an hour?" "It will be." He turned to go back to the barn, but at the door he stopped. "Ruth." She looked up. Carter McAllister made a mistake when he put that letter in the mail. He thought he was dealing with a woman who had no one to stand beside her. He paused. He was wrong. He went out before she could answer, and Ruth stood in the kitchen with the telegram in her pocket and the smell of supper starting to fill the room, and she realized that she had not cried in a very long time. Not because she hadn't wanted to, but because crying required a kind of safety she had not allowed herself. And standing there in Seth Calloway's kitchen, she felt something shift inside her, a crack in the wall she had built so carefully over the years. It terrified her. And it also, in a way she could not name, felt like coming home. The next 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that surprised everyone. The days were hot and long, the work relentless, but the house had begun to change. It was no longer just a place where Seth slept and ate. There were curtains now, simple ones Ruth had sewn from flour sacks. There was a jar of wildflowers on the kitchen table, picked by Annie and arranged with the fierce concentration of a 7-year-old artist. There was bread cooling on the counter every afternoon, and the smell of it drifted through the rooms and made the house feel like something more than timber and nails. Eli had stopped watching Seth with the guarded wariness of a stray dog. He still measured his words carefully, but he had begun to ask questions about the ranch, about the horses, about the way the seasons worked on the prairie. And Seth answered them without making the boy feel like he was being taught, which was a kind of teaching in itself. Jake, who had been skeptical of having a woman in the house, had become Ruth's most vocal supporter. He ate everything she put in front of him and told anyone who would listen that Seth had finally done something smart for a change. And when the topic of Carter McAllister came up in the bunkhouse one evening, Jake said, "Let him come. I'd like to see him try something with the boss standing in the way." It was said with a certainty that surprised even Jake, because he had not realized until that moment how much he had come to care about what happened to the woman and her children. But not everyone in Harlan's Crossing was so accepting. The town had a way of absorbing news and processing it through its own peculiar filter, and by the end of the second week, there were whispers. A widow living alone with a bachelor rancher. 2 children with no proper schooling. The whole arrangement was, as Gertrude Albright put it at the Methodist Women's Circle, irregular at best and scandalous at worst. Gertrude had been the unofficial guardian of public morality in Harlan's Crossing for so long that most people had stopped noticing. She was a large woman with a small mouth and an opinion on everything, and she had decided that Ruth McAllister was a threat to the moral fabric of the town. She said so to anyone who would listen, and to some who would not. Ruth encountered her for the first time on a Tuesday morning at the general store. She had walked into town with Annie to pick up supplies, and Gertrude had stepped into her path on the boardwalk with the deliberate precision of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "You're the woman out at Calloway's ranch," Gertrude said. It was not a question. "I am," Ruth said. Gertrude looked at Annie, who was holding her mother's hand and staring at the silk flower on Gertrude's hat with open admiration. Then Gertrude looked back at Ruth, her eyes narrowing. "I'm sure you understand how this appears to the community. A widow, living under a bachelor's roof. It's not proper." Ruth kept her voice even. "I'm employed as a cook. The children are housed and fed. That's what's proper. People talk, Mrs. McAllister. In a small town, what people think matters. It matters less than whether my daughter eats." Gertrude's mouth tightened. "I'm only trying to help." "Thank you kindly," Ruth said, and she moved past her without another word, pulling Annie along. Annie looked up at her mother as they walked away. "Was that lady being mean?" "That lady was being scared," Ruth said. "And when people are scared, they sometimes act mean." "What's she scared of?" "Things she doesn't understand." "Are we one of the things?" Ruth squeezed her hand. "Probably." She did not tell Seth about the encounter. There was no need. But Seth heard about it anyway, because Harlan's Crossing was the kind of town where news traveled faster than a horse could run, and Gertrude Albright had made sure her opinion was heard by everyone who mattered. He found out from Jake, who had heard it from his cousin, who had heard it from the barber. And that evening after supper, when the children were in bed and the kitchen was quiet, Seth said, "Gertrude Albright give you trouble in town today?" Ruth looked up from the dishpan. "It was nothing I couldn't handle." "I know you can handle it. That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Seth turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The point is that you're on my ranch. What people say about you reflects on this place and the people in it. And I don't take that lightly." Ruth set down the cloth. "Seth, people were going to talk the minute I drove through your gate. There is no version of this where they don't talk. A widow, 2 children, working alone in a man's house. It doesn't matter how correct we are, how proper, how careful, they will talk. So there's nothing to go fix. There's just us doing the right thing and letting them wear themselves out." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're not bothered by it." "I didn't say that." Her voice was careful, honest. "I said there's nothing to go fix. Those are different statements." Seth looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, more like recalibrating, like a man who had expected one kind of woman and was finding another, and was not sure yet what to do with that information. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. She went back to the dishes, and Seth sat at the table, and outside the summer night pressed down on everything, thick and warm and indifferent to what people in small towns decided to think. What Seth did not tell her was that Gertrude Albright was not the only one talking. Wade Pruitt, who carried a badge and a chip on his shoulder in roughly equal measure, had ridden past the Northridge gate twice in the last 4 days, not stopping, just looking, letting himself be seen. Seth had ridden out to meet him the second time. "Something I can help you with, Wade?" he had asked, pulling his horse up even with Pruitt's. Pruitt smiled with his mouth and not the rest of his face. "Just making my rounds." "Your rounds take you down my private road?" "Just checking on things." Pruitt looked toward the house. "Heard you got a woman out here with children." "I hired a cook, like the notice said." Pruitt rocked in his saddle. "Just want to make sure everything's on the up and up, Seth. Small town. People have expectations." "People can keep their expectations on their own property," Seth said. "When something happens on mine that's anyone's legal business, I'll let you know." Pruitt smiled again. "No offense intended." "None taken," Seth said, which was a lie, and they both knew it. He had not told Ruth about Pruitt either. Not yet. There was a time for information and a time for letting a thing breathe, and he had not figured out which this was. What he did know was that the house had begun to feel different. He had lived alone in it for 4 years, since Martha died in the February cold, and the quiet had settled into him like a second skin. He had kept the house because there was nowhere else to be, and because ranches do not stop needing work just because a man's heart quits on him for a while. But he had stopped really living in it. He slept in it and ate in it, and that was about the sum of it. Now there was bread cooling on the kitchen shelf when he came in from the fields. Now there were 2 extra pairs of boots by the door, one large and one small. Annie's rag doll sat on the bench by the window where she had left it and forgotten it. Eli's good jacket hung on the peg by the second hook, which no one had ever used before. And there were sounds. Kitchen sounds. Child sounds. The occasional conversation that he walked into the edges of without meaning to. One morning he came in early and heard Ruth talking to Annie while she braided the girl's hair at the kitchen table. "Hold still, sweetheart. It pulls." "I know. Almost done." "Mama, do you think Mr. Calloway likes us?" A pause. The sound of the braid being secured. "I think Mr. Calloway is a good man who's getting used to having people around." "That's not what I asked." "Annie." "Well, it's not." Another pause. "I think he's warming up. He gave me seconds last night without me even asking." "Yes, he did. That means he likes me." Seth had backed out of the kitchen very quietly and gone around to the barn entrance instead, and he had stood there for a full minute before he could make himself think about horses. It was Eli who surprised him most. The boy had thawed, not fast, not easy, but real. It had started with the fence posts, then moved to small questions about the horses. Then, one afternoon, Seth had looked up from checking a mare's hoof and found Eli standing in the stall doorway, watching with the focused attention of a boy who was actually learning something rather than just waiting to leave. "You want to see?" Seth had asked. Eli stepped in. Seth moved aside. He showed the boy how to check a hoof properly, which way to hold the leg, what to look for, how to clean it without spooking the animal. Eli was quiet through the whole thing, and then he said, "My father never showed me anything like this." Seth did not ask what his father had shown him. Instead, he said, "Different people know different things." Eli nodded. "Can I try?" "Slow," Seth said. "Let her feel you first." Eli did it slow. The mare shifted once, and he steadied her without pulling back. Seth watched without saying anything, and when Eli finished and straightened up, Seth said, "Good." 2 words. Eli carried them around the rest of the day like they were worth something, which Seth understood without meaning to, because he remembered being 12 and knowing exactly how much 2 right words from the right person were worth. Ruth watched them come in from the barn side by side that evening. Eli half a step behind, listening to something Seth was saying about the east pasture grass, and she turned back to the stove quickly because she did not want either of them to see her face just then. She had spent a year trying to put walls between her children and men who said one thing and did another, and she was not ready yet to take those walls down. But she also could not pretend she had not seen what she had seen. Eli had smiled. Not at her, at something Seth said. A real smile, crooked on one side, the one he had had as a little boy before things got complicated. She had seen that smile maybe 4 times in the last year. She stirred the pot and told herself that a kind man and a safe situation were two different things, and that she had been wrong about kind men before. And that was true, and she believed it. And she also could not stop hearing Eli's laugh when it came through the kitchen window 10 minutes later, bright and sudden, and then quickly swallowed back down like he had forgotten himself for a second, and then remembered that forgetting yourself was how you got hurt. She understood that feeling better than she wanted to. That evening, Seth came in from town with the supplies she had put on the list, and also, without comment, without making anything of it, a small jar of honey and a paper bag of lemon drops, which he set on the kitchen counter and left without explanation. Annie found the lemon drops first. "Mama," she said, carrying the bag to Ruth with both hands, "Mr. Calloway brought candy." Ruth looked at the bag, then at the honey sitting beside the flour tin. She had not put either of those on the list. She did not say anything about it at supper. But when Seth passed through the kitchen afterward, and she was finishing the dishes, she said, "Thank you for the honey. Biscuits are better with it," he said. "And the lemon drops?" He stopped walking, did not turn around. Annie said her throat hurt. She mentioned it once, 3 days ago. I remembered. He walked out. Ruth stood at the sink and looked at her hands in the dishwater and made herself think clearly, because it was important to think clearly, because she had made mistakes before when she stopped thinking clearly, and her children were too important for mistakes. But thinking clearly had a limited power over what a person felt when they were not expecting to feel anything. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house had gone quiet, Seth sat on the front porch with a cup of cold coffee and watched the stars wheel slowly over the prairie. He heard the door open behind him, but he did not turn around. Ruth came out and stood at the porch rail, a few feet away, looking out at the same sky. "I got a letter from Douglas Hale today," she said. "The lawyer in Wichita. He says everything is in order. The statement is signed and filed. He says if Carter tries anything, we have a case." "That's good news." "It is," she paused, "but it's not why I came out here." Seth waited. "I want you to know," she said slowly, "that I didn't come here looking for this. I came here looking for a job and a place to keep my children safe. I didn't come here looking for a man who would buy honey for my biscuits and lemon drops for my daughter's throat." She turned to face him. "But I found one anyway, and I don't know what to do with that." Seth set his cup down and stood up. He walked to the rail and stood beside her, close enough that he could see the pale oval of her face in the starlight, but not so close that it would feel like pressure. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "You just have to let it be what it is and see if it grows." Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm scared, Seth. I'm scared that I'm seeing things that aren't there because I want them to be there. I'm scared that I'm trusting too fast and that my children will pay for it." "That's a fair fear," he said. "You've earned the right to it. And what if it turns out I'm wrong? Then we'll deal with that when it comes." He looked at the sky. "But I don't think you're wrong." She looked at him then, a long, searching look. And something in her face softened, just a fraction, like ice beginning to crack at the edges. "Good night, Seth." "Good night, Ruth." She went inside, and Seth stayed on the porch, and the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere on the road to Harlan's Crossing, a man who had been asking questions about a woman with 2 children finally got the answer he had been waiting for. He folded the paper with the Northridge address on it and put it in his pocket, and he began to ride west. The morning after the porch conversation came in soft and gray, the sun struggling through a layer of clouds that had moved in overnight, promising rain by afternoon. Ruth was at the stove before the first light had fully touched the window, moving through her work with the quiet efficiency that had become her signature. But there was something different in the way she held herself this morning. A slight unguarding, a fraction less tension in her shoulders. Seth noticed it when he came in from the barn, and he noticed that she did not turn away when he entered the room. She set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked, and she said, "I've been thinking about what you said last night." He wrapped his hands around the cup and waited. "I'm not ready to say that I trust this," she said carefully, "but I'm ready to stop pretending I don't see it." She looked at him directly. "That's as far as I can go right now." "That's far enough," Seth said. She nodded once, and they let the silence settle between them, comfortable in a way it had not been before. The rain came at noon, a hard summer storm that swept across the prairie with the kind of violence that made men seek shelter and animals go still. It hammered the roof and turned the yard to mud and sent streams of water running off the eaves like curtains. Ruth stood at the kitchen window watching it, and Annie sat at the table with her rag doll, singing a song about a rabbit and a fence post that she had learned somewhere on the road from Missouri. Eli came in from the barn, soaked to the bone, and Ruth handed him a towel without a word. He dried his hair and stood by the stove, letting the warmth soak into him. "Jake says the creek's rising fast," he said. "He's worried about the east pasture crossing." Seth looked up from the account book he had been pretending to read. "We'll check it when the rain lets up. Can't do anything now." Eli nodded and sat down at the table, and for a while the only sounds were the rain and the occasional crack of thunder and Annie's soft singing. It was the kind of ordinary moment that felt, to someone who had lived through enough extraordinary ones, almost unbearably precious. The storm passed by mid-afternoon, and Seth and Eli rode out to check the crossing. The creek had indeed risen, but it had not breached the banks, and the fence line was intact. They spent an hour clearing debris from the water gap, working side by side without needing to talk much. By the time they headed back, the clouds were breaking up, and the sun was coming through in long golden shafts that made the wet prairie steam like something newly born. They were halfway to the house when they saw the rider coming from the direction of town. A man on a bay horse, moving at a steady trot, not hurrying but not lingering either. Seth reined in and waited, his hand resting loosely on the pommel of his saddle, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. The man pulled up when he was 20 feet away. He was middle-aged, with a face that had been shaped by years of sun and wind and not much laughter. He wore a dusty coat and a hat that had seen better days, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew his business. "Calloway?" the man asked. "That's me. Name's Hargrove. I run the general store in town." Seth nodded. He had seen the man before, though they had never spoken more than a few words. Hargrove shifted in his saddle. "There's a man in town asking questions. Wanted to know about the woman you got out here. Said he was family." Seth's jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I didn't know anything about her personal affairs. Told him to mind his own business." Hargrove's eyes were steady. "But I figured you ought to know he's here. He's got a room at the boarding house, and he's been talking to anyone who'll listen. Says he's her brother-in-law. Says he's concerned about the children." Seth looked at Eli. The boy's face had gone pale, but he held himself still. "Thank you for the warning," Seth said. Hargrove nodded once. "Didn't seem right to keep it to myself." He touched his hat and turned his horse back toward town. Seth watched him go, then looked at Eli. "Let's get back to the house." They rode the rest of the way in silence. Ruth was at the door when they arrived, having seen them from the window. She read the look on their faces before either of them spoke. "He's here," she said. It was not a question. "In town," Seth said, "staying at the boarding house." Ruth's hand went to the doorframe, steadying herself. She stood there for a moment, processing the information, and then she straightened her shoulders and stepped back into the kitchen. "Then we know where he is. That's better than not knowing." Seth followed her inside. Eli lingered at the door, his face tight with a fear he was trying hard not to show. "What's the plan?" Ruth asked. She was already reaching for her apron, as if the ordinary act of putting it on would ground her. "The plan is we don't change anything," Seth said. "We go about our business. We don't give him a reason to think he's gotten under our skin. And if he comes out here, then we talk to him, together, on our ground." Ruth studied him for a moment. "You're not afraid of him." "I'm not afraid of much," he paused. "But I'm careful. There's a difference." She nodded slowly. "All right, then we go about our business." They did. The afternoon passed in its usual rhythm. Ruth started supper. Seth and Eli went back to the barn to finish the evening chores. Jake came in from the south pasture and was told about the visitor, and he said nothing, but he sharpened his knife at the kitchen table for a good 15 minutes after supper, which was his way of expressing concern. The knock came just as the sun was setting. A single firm rap on the front door. Ruth was at the stove. She did not turn around. Seth set down his coffee cup and walked to the door, opening it to find a man standing on the porch, silhouetted against the orange sky. Carter McAllister was not a large man, but he carried himself like one. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with a face that had been softened by comfort and hardened by a sense of entitlement. He wore a suit coat that was too fine for the setting, and he had the kind of smile that was meant to disarm, but instead put everyone on edge. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I apologize for the late hour. I'm Carter McAllister. I believe you've heard of me." "I've heard," Seth said. He did not step aside. Carter's smile did not waver. "I've come to see my brother's family. I understand they're staying here." "They're not staying," Seth said. "They're living here. Mrs. McAllister is employed as my cook, and her children reside with her." "Of course." Carter's tone was smooth, practiced. "I only want to speak with her, to assure myself that she and the children are well. Surely you can understand a family member's concern." Seth looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "Come in, but you'll speak to her in my presence." Carter's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He stepped into the kitchen, and his eyes found Ruth immediately. She had turned from the stove and was standing with her hands at her sides, her face unreadable. "Ruth," Carter said, and his voice shifted into a register of warmth that did not match his eyes. "You look well." "I am well," Ruth said. "And the children, where are they?" "They're in the back room. They don't need to see you." Carter's smile flickered. "I'm their uncle. I have a right." "You have no rights here." Ruth's voice was flat, hard as stone. "You're in Kansas now, Carter. You have no jurisdiction, no authority, and no claim. I have a lawyer. I have a signed statement of employment and housing. I have witnesses." She took a step forward. "You have nothing but a long ride back to Missouri." Carter's face went through a series of shifts, each one a fraction of a second long. The practiced warmth faded, replaced by something colder, harder. He looked at Ruth, then at Seth, and then back at Ruth. "I came here to offer you a way out," he said. "A decent life for you and the children, a home, a future." He paused. "If you refuse, I will make this as difficult as I can. I have resources. I have connections. I can tie you up in legal proceedings for years. I can make your life here unbearable." "You can try," Seth said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavier. Carter looked at him. "This isn't your fight, Calloway. Everything that happens on my property is my fight." Seth moved so that he was standing between Carter and Ruth, not aggressively, but with the finality of a closed door. "You've said what you came to say. Now you need to leave." Carter held his gaze for a long, charged moment. Then he smiled again, but it was a different smile now, one that acknowledged the lines had been drawn. He turned to Ruth. "I'll be in town for a few more days. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." He walked out without another word. Seth closed the door behind him and stood there, listening to the sound of hooves retreating down the lane. Then he turned to Ruth. She was still standing in the middle of the kitchen, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale. But she did not tremble. "You did good," Seth said. She looked at him, and something in her eyes softened, just slightly. "He's not going to stop." "I know. But we're not going to stop either." "No," Seth said, "we're not." That night, after the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea, staring at the lamp flame. Seth came in from checking the barn and sat down across from her. "You should get some sleep," he said. "I know." She did not move. He waited. After a long silence, she said, "I left Missouri because I thought if I got far enough away, he would lose interest. I thought distance would make him forget." She shook her head slowly. "I underestimated him." "We underestimated him," Seth corrected. "Now we know better." She looked up at him. "What if he does what he says? What if he finds a way to make this a legal fight that drags out for years?" "Then we fight it for years." His voice was steady, unshaken. "I've got a good lawyer. I've got a good ranch. I've got a good reason." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't sign up for this." "Neither did you." He leaned back in his chair. "But here we are. Might as well make the best of it." She almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but it was real. "You're a stubborn man," Seth Calloway. "I've been called worse." They sat in the lamplight. the quiet settling around them like a blanket. And for the first time since the letter had arrived, Ruth felt something that was not quite hope, but was closer to it than she had been in a long time. The next morning, Seth rode into town alone. He did not tell Ruth where he was going, but she knew. She watched him from the kitchen window as he saddled his horse and rode out, and she did not try to stop him. He found Carter McAllister at the boarding house, sitting on the front porch with a newspaper and a cup of coffee, looking like he had all the time in the world. Seth dismounted and walked up the steps without being invited. "Mr. Calloway," Carter said, folding his newspaper with deliberate calm. "I didn't expect to see you so soon. I'm only going to say this once." Seth stood in front of him, his hands loose at his sides, his voice level. "You will leave Ruth McAllister alone. You will not come to my property again. You will not speak to her children. You will not write letters or send riders or hire men to ask questions. You will get on your horse and you will ride back to Missouri, and you will forget that you ever had a brother's family to claim." Carter's smile was thin. "And if I don't? Then you'll find out what happens when a man pushes something that doesn't push back easily." The two men looked at each other. The morning sun was warm, and the street was beginning to stir, but neither of them moved. "I've dealt with men like you before," Carter said quietly. "You think you're protecting her, but you're just a obstacle, and obstacles can be removed." "Try it," Seth said. He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode out of town without looking back. Carter watched him go, his smile fading into something harder. He picked up his coffee, but he did not drink it. He sat there for a long time, thinking, and then he went inside and wrote a letter to an address in Missouri that he had not used in years. That evening, when Seth rode back to the ranch, Ruth was waiting at the gate. She did not ask where he had been. She simply opened the gate for him, and when he rode through, she walked beside him up to the house. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did." She looked at him, and she did not argue. Inside, the children were setting the table, and the smell of supper filled the house. And for a moment, standing in the doorway of the kitchen that had become something more than just a room where food was cooked, Ruth McAllister allowed herself to imagine a future in which she did not have to be afraid. It was a dangerous thing to imagine, she knew. But standing there, with the light falling warm across the floor and the sound of her children's voices in the air, she let herself feel it anyway. The morning after Seth rode into town to confront Carter McAllister arrived wrapped in a heat that felt personal. The sun came up mean and bright, and by the time Ruth had the stove lit, the air in the kitchen was already thick with the promise of another punishing July day. She moved through her work with the same steady competence she always carried, but there was a new tension in the way she kept glancing toward the window, toward the road that led to Harlan's Crossing. Seth had not told her the details of his conversation with Carter, and she had not asked. But she could read a man's face, and she had seen the set of his jaw when he rode back through the gate the evening before. The conversation had not been friendly, and it had not been final. Seth came in from the barn at his usual time, washed his hands at the pump, and sat down to breakfast without a word about the previous day. He ate what she put in front of him, drank his coffee, and helped Eli with a question about the fence line that needed mending. It was only when the children had left the table that he said, "Carter sent a letter to Wade Pruitt. I heard about it from Hargrove this morning. He rode out to the store before dawn to tell me." Ruth's hands paused on the plate she was drying. "What kind of letter?" "The kind that tries to make Pruitt think he's got a reason to get involved. Claims you're being kept here against your will. Claims I've got some kind of hold over you." Ruth set the plate down slowly. "That's ridiculous." "I know it is. Pruitt knows it is. But Carter's counting on the fact that Pruitt's got a badge and a chip on his shoulder and might see an opportunity to throw his weight around." Seth picked up his coffee cup, then set it down again without drinking. "Pruitt rode out to the east property line yesterday afternoon. Didn't come all the way to the house, just sat there on his horse for a while, looking. Jake saw him." Ruth felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to let him come to us. If he wants to ask questions, he can ask them to my face. And when he does, I'll show him the papers from Douglas Hale and the statement you signed. I'll remind him that the law in Kansas has a name for a man who tries to take children from a widowed mother who's done nothing wrong. Seth's voice was flat, uninflected, and then he'll decide whether he wants to be Carter McAllister's tool or a man who does his job properly. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. You've thought this through. I've had time to think. She turned back to the dishes, but her hands were not steady. What if Pruitt doesn't care about the law? What if he's the kind of man who does what he wants because he can? Then we deal with that when it comes. Seth stood up. But I don't think he is. I think he's the kind of man who talks big and folds when he sees something solid standing in front of him. He went to the door, but before he stepped out, he turned back. Ruth, whatever happens, you're not facing it alone. You understand that? She nodded, not trusting her voice. He went out, and she stood in the kitchen with her hands in the dishwater and let herself feel the full weight of what he had said. You're not facing it alone. It was such a simple thing, such an ordinary promise. But she had learned that ordinary promises were the only kind that mattered, because they were the ones a person could actually keep. Pruitt came the next day. He rode up to the house at mid-morning, his horse moving at the slow, deliberate pace of a man who wanted to announce his presence. Ruth saw him from the kitchen window and called Eli inside. She did not want the boy to see whatever was about to happen, at least not from the front row. Seth was in the barn, but he must have seen Pruitt coming as well, because he was at the gate before Pruitt could dismount. The two men stood facing each other, separated by the wooden bars of the gate, and Ruth watched from the window with her heart beating hard and slow. "Morning, Seth," Pruitt said, his voice carried in the still air. "Wade, got a letter from a man named Carter McAllister. Says he's concerned about his brother's widow and her children. Says he thinks they might be in some kind of trouble out here." Seth did not move. "And you came all the way out here based on a letter from a man you've never met?" "I came out here because it's my job to look into things when people make claims." Pruitt shifted in his saddle. "You got any reason I shouldn't?" "I've got plenty of reasons." Seth reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. He held them up. "This is a signed statement from Mrs. McAllister confirming her employment as my cook, her wages, her living conditions, and her voluntary residence on this property. It's witnessed by myself and my hired man, Jake Hinton." This is a letter from a licensed attorney in Wichita, Douglas Hale, confirming that Mrs. McAllister has full legal standing as a widowed mother under Kansas law, and that no claim from any party in another state has any bearing on her custody of her children. And this is a copy of the deed to this ranch, which will show that I've held this land for 12 years without a single complaint from any soul in this county. Pruitt looked at the papers, then at Seth's face. "That's a lot of paper. It's a lot of legal ground. You want to read them, you're welcome to. But I'll tell you straight, Wade. Carter McAllister is a man who lost a legal fight before it started, and he's trying to win it through rumor and influence. You decide whether you want to be part of that." Pruitt was quiet for a long time. He looked at the house, where Ruth was standing in the window, visible now. He looked at Eli, who had come to the door despite being told to stay inside, and was standing in the frame with his arms crossed, watching. Then he looked back at Seth. "I don't know Carter McAllister," Pruitt said slowly, "and I don't know you, not really. But I know this county, and I know that in the time Mrs. McAllister has been here, there hasn't been a single complaint filed against her or against you. No disturbances, no trouble. Just a woman doing her work and a man minding his business." He rocked in his saddle once. "I'll tell Carter McAllister that I looked into his concerns and found nothing to warrant further action." Seth nodded. "I appreciate that, Wade." Pruitt touched the brim of his hat. "Don't appreciate it yet. I'm just doing my job." He turned his horse and rode back down the lane, taking his time, as if to show that he had not been hurried. Ruth let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She turned from the window and found Eli still standing in the door, his face a mixture of relief and something that looked almost like pride. "Mama," he said, "he didn't even ask to come in." "No," she said, "he didn't." Seth came through the door a moment later, folding the papers and putting them back in his pocket. He looked at Ruth, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. But something had passed between them, something that did not need words. The news of Pruitt's visit spread through Harlan's Crossing by that evening, and the version that circulated was not the one Carter McAllister had hoped for. Dot Haynes made sure of that. She had a way of being present at exactly the right moments, and she had been at Hargrove's store when Pruitt stopped in to buy tobacco after leaving the ranch. Pruitt had said only that he had investigated a claim and found it had no merit, but Dot had read the subtext the way she read everything, and she had carried it to the Methodist Women's Circle, to the barber shop, to the post office, and to anyone else who would listen. By the end of the week, the prevailing opinion in town was that the stranger at the boarding house was not what he appeared to be, and that the woman at the Northridge Ranch had been through enough without having to defend herself against baseless accusations. Gertrude Albright tried to push back, but even she could not argue with the fact that no formal complaint had been filed and no evidence of wrongdoing had been produced. The wind was shifting, slowly, but it was shifting. Carter McAllister felt the shift. He had spent enough time in small towns to read the temperature, and he knew that his window was closing. He had come to Harlan's Crossing expecting to find a frightened woman who could be pressured into submission. Instead, he had found a woman with a lawyer, a rancher with a spine, and a community that was beginning to close ranks against him. He was not accustomed to losing, and the unfamiliarity of it made him careless. On Friday evening, Seth received word from Hargrove that Carter had been seen heading east out of town with his belongings. The message came by way of a stable hand who had been paid to keep an eye on the boarding house. Seth read the note and set it on the kitchen table. "He's gone," he said. Ruth looked up from the sewing in her lap. "Gone where?" "East, back toward Missouri, from the direction he was heading." She set the sewing down slowly. "You're sure?" "I'm sure he left. I'm not sure he won't be back." Seth sat down across from her. "But for now, he's gone, and that's something." Ruth looked at the note, then at Seth. "You had someone watching him?" "I had someone keeping an ear open. That's different." She almost smiled. "You're more careful than I gave you credit for." "I've learned that being careful is cheaper than being sorry." They sat in the quiet of the kitchen, the lamp casting long shadows across the room. Annie had fallen asleep on the bench, her head resting on her rag doll, and Eli was in his room, reading a book that Miss Cartwright, the teacher, had lent him from the small collection at the schoolhouse. "You should wake Annie and put her to bed properly," Seth said. "In a minute." Ruth did not move. She was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Seth, why are you doing all of this?" He had answered this question before, but she needed to hear it again, needed to hear it in the quiet of a kitchen, with the threat receded and the truth of the moment pressing down on them. "Because it's right," he said. "Because you and those children deserve a place to stand. Because I spent 4 years in this house with nothing but my own company, and I didn't realize how empty it was until it wasn't empty anymore." He paused. "Because I want to." Ruth held his gaze. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to. That's not how this works." She looked down at her hands. "I've spent so long being careful, being afraid. I don't know how to stop." "You don't have to stop all at once. You just have to start." She looked up at him, and something in her face cracked open, just a little. And then she said, "I think I'd like to try." They sat in the kitchen, the lamp burning low, and they did not say anything more. But they did not need to. The silence had become a language of its own, one that they were both learning to speak. The next week passed without incident. Carter did not reappear. No letters came. Pruitt made his rounds without stopping at the Northridge gate. The summer heat continued to press down, but the days had lost some of their tension, and the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Eli continued to work alongside Jake during the day, and in the evenings, Seth showed him how to repair harness leather and mend fence lines. The boy's questions had become less guarded, more curious. He asked about the land, about the cattle, about the way the seasons worked on the prairie. And Seth answered each question with the same patience he gave to everything, letting the boy learn at his own pace. Annie's cough had improved, the honey and the lemon drops had helped, but more than that, the steady meals and the dry bed and the absence of fear had done what medicine could not. She had begun to fill out, her cheeks rounding, her laughter coming more easily. She followed Ruth around the kitchen like a small shadow, learning to knead dough and sort beans, and she talked constantly, as if the words had been dammed up inside her for too long and were finally spilling out. Ruth watched her children and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. It was not happiness, exactly, because happiness was still too fragile a word for what was growing in her chest. But it was a kind of peace, tentative and new, like grass pushing up through soil that had been packed hard for years. On a Wednesday evening in the first week of August, Ruth was sitting on the front porch after supper, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to the deep velvet of early night. Seth came out and sat on the steps beside her, his forearms resting on his knees. "Annie asked me a question today," he said. Ruth looked at him. "What kind of question?" She asked if I was going to be her father now. Ruth's breath caught. She had not expected that, had not prepared for it. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that I was going to be the man who took care of her and her brother and her mother, and that whatever name she wanted to call me was fine with me." He paused. "She said she'd think about it." Ruth let out a laugh, surprised out of her. "That sounds like her. She's got good judgment." He looked at her sideways. "Takes after her mother." The words hung in the air between them, simple and charged. Ruth felt her heart beating in her throat. "Seth," she said. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've been for the past 12 years. Scared, guarded, ready to leave at any moment." She looked at him. "But I'm learning, and I want you to know that what you said to Annie about being the man who takes care of us, I believe you." He turned to face her fully. "That's all I need." They sat in the dark as the stars came out, one by one, and the night wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain. Somewhere in the house, Annie murmured in her sleep, and Eli's lamp flickered as he turned a page in his book. The sounds of a home being made, of lives being knitted together. And for the first time in years, Ruth McAllister allowed herself to believe that she might be safe. Not because the threats had disappeared, because she knew they had not. Carter was out there somewhere, nursing his defeat, waiting for another opening, but because she was not facing them alone, and that made all the difference. The night was quiet and warm, and the stars stretched across the Kansas sky like a promise that had been kept. The morning after the porch conversation arrived wrapped in a stillness that felt almost sacred. The sun rose slow over the eastern prairie, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose, and the air carried a coolness that would burn off by mid-morning, but for now felt like a gift. Ruth woke before the children, as she always did, and she lay in the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. The creak of the floorboards as the house adjusted to the warmth. The distant lowing of cattle from the pasture. The soft, even breathing of Annie curled in the bed beside her. She had not slept well, but that was not unusual. What was unusual was the nature of the thoughts that had kept her awake. They were not fears, not calculations of escape routes or contingency plans. They were images. Seth's face in the lamplight. The way he had said he wanted to be the man who took care of them. The weight of his presence beside her on the porch, solid and unshakable. She had spent so long bracing against the next blow that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be held, not physically, but by the certainty of another person's commitment. She rose and dressed in the gray light, and when she stepped into the kitchen, she found Seth already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the waking prairie. He turned when he heard her, and his face softened in a way that made her chest tighten. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Not much." She moved to the stove and lit it, the familiar motions grounding her. "You? Sleep's been a luxury I haven't had much use for lately." She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the crackle of the fire in the stove. Outside, a bird called, a clear, rising note that cut through the stillness. "Seth," she said, and he looked at her. "I've been thinking." "That's a dangerous habit," she almost smiled. "About what you said to Annie, about being the man who takes care of us." He waited. "I want you to know that I see it. I see what you're doing, what you're offering, and I'm not running from it." She paused, choosing her words with care. "But I need to know that it's real. I need to know that when the hard times come, and they will come, You won't decide that it's too much and walk away." Seth set his cup down. "Ruth, I've been alone in this house for 4 years. I know what it's like to have nothing but your own thoughts and the sound of the wind. And I know that what's growing here, between you and me and those children, it's not something I'm going to let go of because the road gets rough." He leaned forward. "I'm not a man who makes promises I can't keep, and I'm not a man who walks away when it gets hard. You asked me once why I let you through that gate. I told you about my sister. But there's more to it than that. I let you through because I looked at you sitting there with your children, and I saw someone who had been knocked down more times than she could count and was still sitting straight. That kind of strength doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a place that doesn't quit. And I decided right then that I wanted to be near it." Ruth looked down at her hands wrapped around the coffee cup. Her fingers were trembling, just slightly. She did not know if it was from exhaustion or from the weight of his words. Probably both. "That's a lot to live up to," she said quietly. "You don't have to live up to anything. You just have to be who you are." They sat in the growing light, the coffee cooling between them, and something settled into place that had been shifting for weeks. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise spoken aloud. It was a recognition, mutual and quiet, that they had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The day unfolded in its usual rhythm. Eli went with Jake to check the cattle. Annie helped Ruth with the morning chores, carrying eggs from the henhouse with the solemn concentration of a child entrusted with something precious. Seth rode out to the south pasture to inspect a section of fence that had been damaged in the last storm. The work was ordinary, grounding, the kind of labor that kept a person from thinking too much. But in the late afternoon, a rider came from town with a letter. It was addressed to Ruth, and it bore the return address of Douglas Hale, the lawyer in Wichita. Ruth took it from the rider's hand and stood in the yard, staring at the envelope as if it might bite her. She opened it, standing there, in the full heat of the afternoon sun, and read it twice before she fully understood what it said. Douglas Hale wrote that Carter McAllister had not, in fact, returned to Missouri. He had traveled to Wichita and retained a lawyer there, a man named Thaddeus Quinn, who had a reputation for being aggressive and creative with the truth. Quinn had filed a petition in the district court asking for a hearing on the matter of the McAllister children's welfare, citing concerns about their living situation and the moral character of their mother's employer. The hearing had been scheduled for the first week of September, just 3 weeks away. Hale advised that Ruth's presence would be required and that she should prepare to testify. Ruth read the letter a third time, the words blurring slightly in the harsh light. Then she folded it carefully and walked into the house. Seth found her sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of her, her face pale but composed. He read it without asking permission, and when he finished, he set it down and pulled out the chair across from her. "He's not done," Ruth said. Her voice was flat, emptied of emotion. "He's not done," Seth agreed. "He hired a lawyer. He's taking me to court. 3 weeks from now, I have to stand in front of a judge and prove that I'm fit to keep my own children." She pressed her palms flat against the table. "After everything. After the letter, after the visit, after Pruitt, after all of it, he's still coming." Seth reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was the first time he had touched her deliberately, with intention, and the weight of his hand was warm and solid. "Then we go to Wichita," he said. "We get Douglas Hale to represent you. We bring every piece of paper we have, every witness who can speak for you. And we show that judge what kind of woman you are." Ruth looked at his hand on hers, then up at his face. "You would do that? Go with me?" "I would do that." She pulled her hand away, not because she did not want his touch, but because she needed to think clearly, and his presence made thinking clearly almost impossible. "This is going to cost money, more money than I have. I've got money. I can't take your money, Seth. I can't keep taking from you." "It's not taking, it's investing." "Investing in what?" He looked at her steadily. "In a future I want to be part of." The words hung in the air, heavy and bright, and Ruth felt something crack inside her, not break, but crack in the way ice cracks when it begins to thaw. She looked at him, and for a moment she could not speak. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "You don't have to say anything. You just have to let me stand beside you." She nodded, a small jerky motion, and then she stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the prairie that had become her home. The sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows across the grass, and the light was the color of honey. "I've been running for so long," she said, her back to him. "Running from Bernard's temper, running from Carter's ambition, running from the memories of every night I spent wondering if I was doing the right thing by staying or the right thing by leaving. I don't know how to stop." "Maybe you don't stop," Seth said. "Maybe you just change direction. Run toward something instead of away from it." She turned and looked at him, and in the golden light of the late afternoon, she saw him clearly for the first time. Not as a rescuer, not as a solution to her problems, but as a man. Flawed, stubborn, quiet, and profoundly good. "What am I running toward?" she asked. He did not answer with words. He stood up and walked to her, and he took her hand again, and he said, "Let's find out together." The next 2 weeks were a flurry of preparation. Letters flew between the ranch and Wichita. Douglas Hale outlining the strategy, requesting documents, preparing the ground for the hearing. Ruth gathered every piece of evidence she could find. The signed statement of her employment, witness accounts from Jake and Hargrove and Dot Haynes, a letter from Miss Cartwright attesting to Eli's enrollment in school and his good behavior, and a statement from Pastor Weller about Ruth's character and standing in the community. She wrote down a timeline of her marriage, of her departure from Missouri, of the reasons she had left. It was the hardest thing she had ever written, putting into words the years of small cruelties and broken promises that had led her to a stranger's gate in the middle of a Kansas summer. Seth made arrangements for the ranch to be managed by Jake in his absence. He wrote to Douglas Hale and arranged for a hotel in Wichita. He made sure the wagon was in good repair and the horses were sound for the journey. He did all of it without complaint, without making Ruth feel like a burden, and she watched him with a mixture of gratitude and wonder that she still could not fully name. Eli knew something was happening. He was 12, and he had learned to read the silences in a room the way other children learn to read books. He found Ruth one evening in her room, sitting on the edge of the bed with a stack of papers in her lap, staring at the wall. "Are we leaving?" he asked. Ruth looked up. She had not heard him come in. "No, Eli, we're not leaving." "Then why are you making papers?" She patted the bed beside him, and he sat down, his shoulders tight with the wariness she had hoped was fading. "There's going to be a hearing. In Wichita. Your Uncle Carter has hired a lawyer, and he's trying to convince a judge that you and Annie would be better off with him." Eli's face went still. "Can he do that?" "He's going to try. But we have a lawyer too, a good one, and we have proof that you're well cared for and safe. The judge will see the truth." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if the judge doesn't see it?" Ruth set the papers aside and took his hand. "Then we keep fighting. We don't give up. I didn't bring you all the way across the prairie to let someone take you away from me." Eli looked at her, and his eyes were bright. "Seth is coming with us, right?" "Yes, Seth is coming with us." Eli nodded, and something in his shoulders relaxed, just slightly. "Good," he said. "He's better at talking to people than we are." Ruth almost laughed. "That's a low bar." Eli almost smiled, and that was more precious to her than any document she could have prepared. The morning of their departure arrived clear and cool, a hint of autumn in the air that had not been there the week before. The wagon was loaded with supplies for the journey, a 3-day trip to Wichita. Annie was perched on the seat, her rag doll clutched in her arms, bouncing with excitement at the prospect of traveling. Eli sat beside her, quieter, his eyes scanning the horizon the way they always did when he was uncertain. Ruth stood at the kitchen door for a moment, looking at the house that had become her home. The curtains she had sewn, the jar of wildflowers on the table, brown and dry now, but she had not had the heart to throw them away. The worn spot on the floorboards in front of the stove where she stood every morning. She had been in this house for less than 2 months, but it felt like she had been there for years. Seth came up behind her. "Ready?" She turned and looked at him. He was wearing his good coat, the one he kept for town, and his hat was pulled low against the morning sun. He looked solid, dependable, like the kind of man who would not be moved by whatever they found in Wichita. "Ready," she said. They climbed onto the wagon, Seth taking the reins, Ruth beside him with Annie pressed against her. Eli sat in the back, propped against the supplies, a book open in his lap. The horses started forward, and the wagon rolled down the lane, past the gate that had been the scene of so much change, and out onto the road that led east. The journey to Wichita took 3 days. They camped the first night beside a creek, the stars bright and close above them, and Ruth cooked supper over a fire while Seth tended to the horses. Annie fell asleep early, wrapped in a blanket, her head in Ruth's lap. Eli sat on a fallen log, staring into the flames. "Eli," Ruth said, "come sit closer, it's warmer." He moved, but he did not sit beside her. He sat near Seth, close enough to feel the heat of the fire, and after a moment he said, "What happens if we lose?" Seth looked at him across the flames. "We're not going to lose. But what if we do?" Seth considered the question seriously, the way he considered every question Eli asked. "If we lose, we figure out another way. We appeal. We move. We find a place where Carter McAllister's reach doesn't extend. There's always a way." Eli thought about that. "I don't want to move again. Neither do I. I like the ranch. I like the horses. I like Jake, even though he talks too much." He paused. "I like you." Seth's face did not change, but something in his eyes softened. "I like you too, Eli." Ruth watched them, her heart full to bursting, and she did not trust herself to speak. The fire crackled, and the creek murmured, and the stars wheeled overhead, and for a few hours the world felt smaller and kinder than it had any right to be. They reached Wichita on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The town was larger than Harlan's Crossing, with brick buildings and board sidewalks, and a constant flow of wagons and riders that made Annie press close to Ruth's side. They found the hotel Douglas Hale had recommended, a clean, modest establishment on the main street, and settled into their rooms. Ruth had never been to Wichita. She stood at the window of their room, looking out at the unfamiliar streets, and felt the weight of the coming hearing pressing down on her. Somewhere in this town, Carter McAllister was staying in his own hotel, preparing his own arguments. Somewhere, a judge was reading the filings, forming his impression of her before she had ever said a word. There was a knock at the door. Ruth opened it to find Seth standing in the hallway, a piece of paper in his hand. "Douglas Hale sent a message. He wants to meet with us tonight, to go over what you'll say tomorrow." Ruth nodded and stepped into the hall, closing the door behind her. "Is he confident?" "He's a lawyer. He's never confident. But he's prepared." Seth looked at her. "How are you?" "I'm scared." "That's reasonable. I don't want to lose my children." "You won't." She looked at him, and she wanted to believe him with a desperation that surprised her. "How do you know?" "Because I know you, and I know what you've built, and I know that no judge with eyes to see and ears to hear could look at you and those children and think they'd be better off anywhere else." He paused. "And because I'm standing beside you, and I don't lose things I care about." She reached out and took his hand. "Thank you. For all of it. You don't have to thank me. I know. But I want to." They stood in the dim hallway of the hotel, holding hands, and the world outside the window continued its busy, indifferent motion. But inside that small space, something had taken root that would not be easily uprooted. The next morning, Ruth McAllister walked into the Wichita District Courthouse with her head held high and her children beside her. Seth walked on her right, Douglas Hale on her left, and the weight of their presence was the only thing that kept her knees from buckling. The hearing lasted 2 days. Thaddeus Quinn presented his arguments with the polished skill of a man who had done this many times before. He painted a picture of a widow in desperate circumstances, living in a bachelor's home without proper supervision, her children exposed to moral danger. He called witnesses, or rather, he called a witness, a man named Grimes, who had been in Harlan's Crossing for 1 day and claimed to have seen Ruth behaving inappropriately with Seth Calloway. Douglas Hale took Grimes apart on cross-examination in a way that was almost surgical. He established that Grimes had been paid by Carter McAllister, that he had been in Harlan's Crossing for less than 24 hours, and that his testimony had been prepared in advance. The judge listened, his face giving away nothing, And when Grimes stepped down, he looked smaller than he had when he stepped up. Then it was Ruth's turn. She took the stand and swore to tell the truth. And she did. She spoke about her marriage to Bernard McAllister, about the years of his drinking, about the small cruelties that had accumulated into an unbearable weight. She spoke about leaving, about the 40 days on the road, about the morning she found herself at Seth Calloway's gate with nothing but $11 and a cough that wouldn't quit. She spoke about the job, about the room off the kitchen, about the way her children had begun to heal in the quiet of the ranch. She spoke about Seth, about the honey and the lemon drops, about the way he had stood beside her when Carter came, about the way he had never asked for anything in return. When she finished, the room was silent. The judge looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Carter McAllister, who sat at the defendant's table with a carefully neutral expression. The judge took 2 days to deliberate. Ruth spent those 2 days in the hotel, hardly eating, hardly sleeping, her children close to her at all times. Seth stayed with them, running errands, bringing food, sitting with her in the long silences when the waiting became unbearable. On the second afternoon, a messenger came to the hotel with a note from Douglas Hale. The judge had reached his decision. They gathered in the courtroom, the same room where Ruth had testified, and the judge entered and took his seat. He read his decision in a flat, unhurried voice. The court found that Ruth McAllister was a fit and proper guardian for her children. The court found that her living situation at the Northridge Ranch was stable, moral, and conducive to the children's welfare. The court found that Carter McAllister's petition was without merit and dismissed it with prejudice. The children would remain with their mother. Costs were awarded to the respondent. Ruth sat frozen, the words washing over her like water, unable to fully comprehend them. Then Annie's hand slipped into hers, and Eli let out a breath she had not realized he was holding, and Seth's hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and solid. She had won. She turned and looked at Carter McAllister. He was sitting perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled fury, and for a moment their eyes met. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply looked at him, and then she looked away, because he did not deserve any more of her attention. Outside the courthouse, the sun was bright, and the air was clean, and Ruth stood on the steps with her children, and the man who had made it possible, and she felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She felt free. The journey back from Wichita took 4 days instead of 3, because Ruth asked to stop at a creek she had noticed on the way east. A bend in the water where cottonwoods grew tall, and the grass was thick and green even in the late summer heat. She wanted to sit there for an hour, she said, with her children and the man who had helped her win them back, and simply breathe. Seth did not question it. He pulled the wagon off the road and helped her down, and they sat on the bank of the creek while Annie threw pebbles into the water, and Eli lay on his back in the grass, staring up at the sky through the leaves. Ruth leaned against the trunk of a cottonwood, and Seth sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm without it touching hers. "I keep waiting to wake up," she said. "I keep thinking this is a dream, and I'm going to open my eyes and be back in that hotel room, waiting for the judge to decide." "You're not dreaming," Seth said. "I know, but my heart hasn't caught up to my head yet." He picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water. It bounced 4 times before sinking. Hearts take longer than heads to believe good news. That's just how they're built. She watched the ripples spread across the surface of the creek. What happens now? Now we go home. We get back to the ranch. We finish out the summer and bring in the fall harvest. We get Eli started in school proper with Miss Cartwright. We teach Annie how to ride that pony you've been eyeing for her. He paused. And we figure out what we want the rest of our lives to look like. Ruth turned to look at him. "You've thought about this." "I've had time to think." "What do you want the rest of your life to look like, Seth Calloway?" He looked at her, and the afternoon light filtered through the cottonwood leaves and fell across his face in patterns of gold and shadow. "I want a house that's full of noise. I want a kitchen that smells like bread and coffee. I want a woman who looks at me like I'm worth something, and children who call me by my name without flinching." He smiled, a slow, rare thing. "I want to wake up every morning knowing that the people I care about are under the same roof. Ruth felt her throat tighten. That's a lot to want. It's not a lot. It's just the right things. She reached out and took his hand, and they sat like that, hands intertwined, watching the children play in the shallow water and the dappled light. And for the first time in her life, Ruth McAllister allowed herself to believe that the future was not something to be feared, but something to be built. They reached the ranch late on the fourth day, the sun dipping below the horizon as the familiar outline of the house came into view. Jake was waiting at the gate, and when he saw them, he let out a whoop that scared the chickens and brought the bunkhouse hands running. They had heard the news through the telegraph line, a message from Douglas Hale that had reached Harlan's Crossing 2 days before, and the whole ranch had been waiting. Eli and Annie were lifted off the wagon and passed from hand to hand like precious cargo. Jake shook Seth's hand so hard that Seth winced, and then he turned to Ruth and, to everyone's surprise, enfolded her in a bear hug that lifted her off her feet. "Welcome home, Mrs. McAllister," he said. "And I mean that. This is your home now." Ruth laughed, a sound that surprised her with its ease. "Thank you, Jake." That night, the bunkhouse hands joined them for supper, and Ruth cooked a meal that stretched the table to its limits. There was laughter, and there were stories, and there was a kind of joy that had not been present in the house since before Martha died. Seth watched it all from his place at the head of the table, and he said very little, but the look on his face spoke volumes. After the meal, after the dishes were cleared and the children were in bed, Ruth and Seth sat on the front porch, the way they had done so many times before. But this time was different. The tension that had been between them, the unspoken question that had hovered over every conversation, had been answered. The legal threat was gone. The future was open. "I've been thinking," Ruth said, "about what you said at the creek." Seth waited. "I want the same things you want. I want a home that doesn't feel borrowed. I want a man I can trust with my children and my heart." She looked at him in the dim light. "And I think I've found him." Seth turned to face her fully. "Ruth." "I'm not finished." She held up a hand, and he fell silent. "I've spent so many years being afraid that I forgot what it felt like to be brave. But you reminded me. You showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified." She paused. "So I'm going to be brave now. Seth Calloway, I love you. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Seth looked at her, and his eyes were bright in the starlight. "I love you too, Ruth." His voice was rough, as if the words had to force their way past something that had been locked up for a long time. "I've loved you since the morning I found you at my gate. I just didn't know how to say it." "You don't have to say it," she said. "You've been showing it every day." He reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I want to marry you, Ruth McAllister. I want to stand in front of a preacher and a town and God himself and promise to be your husband for the rest of my life." "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes?" "Yes, I'll marry you." He stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed, a low, surprised sound, and he pulled her into his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder, and she felt his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong. And she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than words, that she had come home. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in October, 6 weeks away. That gave Ruth time to sew a dress, and Dot Haynes time to organize a reception, and the whole of Harlan's Crossing time to form opinions about the match, which they did with enthusiasm. Gertrude Albright was notably silent, which was the closest she ever came to an endorsement. Wade Pruitt sent a note of congratulations, which Seth read twice before deciding to believe it. The weeks that followed were the fullest of Ruth's life. She worked alongside Seth from dawn to dusk, helping with the preparations for winter, mending fences, hauling hay. She cooked for the hands and baked bread for the church social, and sewed curtains for the windows of the room that would become hers and Seth's. The house began to transform, not through any grand renovation, but through the accumulation of small touches that turned a structure into a home. Eli and Annie thrived. Eli had grown 1.5 inches since July, and his voice was beginning to change, cracking at unexpected moments that made him flush and Seth hide a smile. He had taken on more responsibility with the cattle, and Jake had begun to trust him with tasks that he would have given only to a grown man. The boy who had stopped talking to strangers was gone, replaced by a young man who was learning to stand on his own. Annie had stopped having nightmares. She still woke early sometimes, but she no longer cried out in the night. She had made friends with the blacksmith's youngest daughter, and the two of them could be found most afternoons chasing barn cats or making daisy chains, or engaged in the kind of elaborate play that only children understand. Ruth watched her children and felt a gratitude so deep it ached. On a Wednesday evening in late September, Seth came in from the barn to find Ruth standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the prairie. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the light fell across her face in a way that made him stop in the doorway. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said without turning around. "Something right." He walked up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. She leaned back into him, and they stood together, watching the day end. "In a week and a half," she said, "I'm going to become your wife." "I know. Does that scare you?" "A little," he admitted. "But not for the reasons you might think." "Then what reasons?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm afraid of being happy. I was happy with Martha, and then she was gone. And I spent 4 years telling myself that I didn't need that kind of happiness again, because losing it nearly broke me." He tightened his hands on her shoulders. "And now you're here, and those children are here, and I'm happier than I've been in years. And I'm terrified of losing it." Ruth turned in his arms and looked up at him. "You're not going to lose it. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are those children." She reached up and touched his face. "I know there are no guarantees. I know the prairie can be harsh and life can be cruel. But I also know that we've been given something rare, and I intend to hold on to it with everything I have." He bent his head and kissed her, the first real kiss they had shared, and it tasted like salt and promise and the beginning of something that would last. The wedding was held at the small chapel at the edge of Harlan's Crossing, the same chapel where they had watched Ruth McAllister ride away that first time. The building was full, standing room only, because word had spread that something special was happening, and the people of Harlan's Crossing had decided to show up. Ruth wore a dress of simple cream cotton that she had sewn herself, with a sprig of wildflowers in her hair. Annie walked down the aisle ahead of her, scattering petals with the solemn concentration of a child who understood the importance of her role. Eli stood beside Seth at the altar, dressed in his good jacket, his face a careful mask of composure that could not quite hide the pride in his eyes. Pastor Weller performed the ceremony with the same quiet sincerity he brought to everything. And when he asked who gave this woman to be married, Eli stepped forward and said, "I do." His voice cracked on the words, and there was not a dry eye in the house. Seth and Ruth exchanged vows that they had written themselves, simple words that spoke of commitment and partnership and the determination to build a life together. They did not promise that it would be easy. They promised that they would face it together. When Pastor Weller pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted into applause. Jake let out a whoop that rivaled the one he had let out when they returned from Wichita, and Annie threw her arms around Ruth's legs and declared that now she had a father after all. The reception was held at the church hall, with food that had been brought by every family in town. Dot Haynes had organized it with her usual efficiency, and there was enough pie to feed an army. Seth and Ruth made their rounds, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, and for the first time, Ruth felt like she truly belonged in this place. Late in the evening, when the children had been put to bed at the hotel and the last guests had gone home, Seth and Ruth sat alone in the church hall, the remnants of the celebration around them. "Mrs. Calloway," Seth said, trying the name out. "Mr. Calloway," she replied. He took her hand. "Thank you." "For what?" "For answering that notice, for sitting at my gate, for giving me a second chance at a life I thought I'd lost." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for opening the gate." They sat in the quiet of the hall, the candles burning low, and they talked about the future, about the ranch, about the children, about the life they would build together. And when they finally left, walking hand in hand through the empty streets of Harlan's Crossing under a canopy of stars, they carried with them a hope that felt as solid as the ground beneath their feet. But the prairie does not grant happiness without testing it. 2 weeks after the wedding, on a morning when the wind had shifted to the west and the sky had taken on a strange, coppery hue, a rider came from the direction of the high plains with news that a fire had broken out on the open range. It was still miles away, driven by winds that howled like living things, but it was moving fast, and it was moving toward the Northridge Ranch. Seth read the message the rider brought, and his face went still in a way that Ruth had learned to recognize. It was the stillness that came over him when he was calculating odds and making decisions. "How long?" he asked. 2 days, maybe less if the wind picks up." The rider, a young man with soot on his face, was already turning his horse. "The whole county's mobilizing. Everybody who can dig a firebreak or wet down a roof is needed." Seth nodded and handed the message to Ruth. She read it, and her blood ran cold. "Is it going to reach us?" she asked. "I don't know." He was already moving toward the barn, "but we're going to act like it is." The next 24 hours were a blur of desperate preparation. Every hand on the ranch, every neighbor within riding distance, came together to dig firebreaks and soak the ground around the buildings. They hauled water from the well in the creek, wetting the roof of the house and the barn and the bunkhouse. They moved the cattle to the east pasture, where the grass was shorter and the creek offered some protection. They worked without rest, without complaint, driven by the knowledge that everything they had built could be consumed in a matter of hours. Ruth worked alongside the men, her dress hitched up, her hands blistered from the shovel. Eli worked beside her, his face set in a grim determination that reminded her of Seth. Annie was sent to stay with Dot Haynes in town because no child should have to watch her home burn. By the evening of the second day, the fire was visible on the horizon, a dull orange glow, pulsing like a heartbeat, growing larger with each passing hour. The wind had not let up. It howled across the prairie, carrying the smell of smoke and the sound of distant crackling. Seth stood on the roof of the house, watching the fire approach, and Ruth climbed up to stand beside him. "Can we stop it?" she asked. "We can try." He pointed to the line of bare earth they had dug, 100 yards wide, stretching across the path of the fire. "If the wind drops, that break will hold. If it doesn't—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Ruth took his hand. "Then we pray for the wind to drop." They stood on the roof, the fire painting their faces orange, and they held on to each other. Below them, the ranch waited, silent and braced. The cattle were lowing in the east pasture, restless and afraid. The horses stamped in the barn. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, and the fire kept coming. The fire kept coming, and then the wind died. It happened at the very edge of what seemed possible, when the flames were close enough that the heat on Seth's face felt like a physical weight, and the smoke had turned the sky a sick shade of copper. The wind had been howling for 2 days, driving the fire across the prairie with a mindless hunger, and then, with no warning and no reason that any man could name, it stopped. Seth was on the roof, a wet blanket in his hands, watching the wall of flame advance across the last stretch of dry grass between the firebreak and the house. He had been calculating how much time they had left, measuring it in heartbeats, when the wind simply ceased. The fire hesitated, as if confused by the sudden absence of its driver. The flames, which had been reaching forward like grasping hands, pulled back, gathered themselves, and began to move more slowly, more cautiously, as if they were a living thing that had lost its nerve. Seth did not waste time wondering why. He shouted down to the men below, his voice raw from smoke and exhaustion. "The wind's dropped! Hit the brake now! Everything you've got!" The hands, who had been wetting down the barn roof and the house, abandoned their posts and grabbed shovels and buckets. They rushed to the firebreak, a wide strip of bare earth that had been plowed and cleared over the past 2 days, and they began to beat back the flames that were still trying to cross. The fire licked at the edge of the break, hesitant, uncertain. Without the wind to push it, it had lost its momentum. Ruth was at the well, working the pump with a rhythm that had become mechanical, her arms burning, her lungs aching from the smoke. She had been hauling water for hours, passing buckets along a chain of hands that stretched from the well to the house. She did not stop when the wind died. She did not stop when she heard Seth shout. She kept pumping, kept moving, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean facing the terror that had been crouched in her chest since the first news of the fire. It was Eli who stopped her. He appeared at her side, his face streaked with soot, his eyes red from the smoke, and he took the pump handle from her hands. "I've got this, Mama. Go see the house." She looked at him, this boy who had been a child when they crossed into Kansas and was now something else entirely. And she wanted to tell him to go to safety, to run, to protect himself. But she saw in his eyes that he was past being sent away. He had chosen to stand his ground. She nodded and ran toward the house, where Seth had climbed down from the roof and was directing the men at the fire break. The flames had reached the edge of the bare earth, but they were not crossing. The fire break was holding. Then a spark jumped. It was a single ember, carried by a residual gust that had not yet given up, and it landed on the roof of the barn. The shingles, dry from weeks of summer heat, caught instantly. A thin curl of smoke rose from the spot, and then a tongue of flame, small at first, then larger, as if the barn had been waiting for this moment to prove that it, too, could burn. Seth saw it at the same time as Jake, and they both moved without speaking. Jake grabbed a bucket and a ladder. Seth ran for the barn door because the horses were still inside. Ruth saw him go and her heart stopped. She followed, her legs moving before her mind could catch up, and she reached the barn door just as Seth emerged, leading the old mare with one hand and the gelding with the other. The horses were wild-eyed, nostrils flared, but they followed him because he was calm and they trusted him. "There's one more," Seth said, not stopping, "the filly in the back stall." He handed the reins to Ruth and turned back into the barn. The fire on the roof was spreading now, the smoke thickening, and the interior of the barn was filling with ash and heat. Ruth stood frozen, the horses pulling against her grip, and she watched the barn door where Seth had disappeared. The seconds stretched into an eternity. She counted them, one by one, each one an impossible weight. Then he emerged, the filly stumbling behind him, her mane singed, her eyes white with fear. He pulled her clear of the door just as a section of the roof collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. Ruth let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She handed the horses to Jake, who had appeared beside her, and she walked to Seth. He was coughing, his face blackened, his hands shaking from the effort of holding the panicked filly. "Don't ever do that again," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Can't promise that," he said, and he managed a thin smile. She did not know whether to hit him or kiss him. She did both, grabbing his shirt and pulling him into an embrace that was half anger and half relief. He held her for a moment, his arms around her, and then he pulled back. "The fire break is holding," he said, "but the barn's going to go. We need to keep the house wet." They worked through the night. The barn burned, a roaring pyre that lit up the prairie for miles. But the fire break held, and the wind did not return. By dawn, the main body of the fire had passed, moving north and east, driven by a new breeze that had sprung up from the south. The ranch was safe. The house was intact. The cattle were scattered but alive. The barn was a smoking ruin. Its timbers collapsed into a heap of ash and char. Ruth sat on the porch steps as the sun rose, her hands blistered, her dress ruined, her hair matted with soot. She watched the smoke rise from the remains of the barn, and she felt nothing but a deep, bone-weary gratitude that they were all still alive. Seth sat down beside her. He did not speak. He simply put his arm around her and pulled her close, and they watched the sunrise together over the blackened prairie. Eli found them there. He walked up from the east pasture where Jake was rounding up the cattle, his face pale with exhaustion. He stopped in front of them and said, "Annie's fine. I rode to town this morning before dawn. She's still with Dot. She doesn't know about the fire." Ruth looked up at him, this son of hers who had become a man overnight. "Thank you, Eli." He nodded, and then he sat down on the step beside them, leaning against Seth's shoulder without asking permission. Seth did not move. He just let the boy rest. They sat like that, the three of them, as the sun climbed higher and the smoke began to clear, and the ranch that had been tested by fire emerged on the other side, battered but unbroken. The days that followed were a blur of recovery. Neighbors came from miles around to help, bringing food and tools and offers of labor. The burned remains of the barn were cleared away, and a new structure began to rise in its place, framed with timber that had been donated by families who remembered their own struggles. The cattle were gathered and counted, and only 3 were lost, a small miracle that Seth attributed to the firebreak and the hard work of the men. Ruth worked alongside everyone, her hands bandaged, her body aching, but her spirit lighter than it had been in months. She had faced fire and loss, and the terror of watching the man she loved walk into a burning building, and she had come through it. The fear that had driven her across the prairie, that had kept her running for so long, had been burned away like the dry grass of the plains. On the 5th day after the fire, when the new barn was beginning to take shape and the rhythm of the ranch was returning to something like normal, a rider came from town. It was not a rider Ruth recognized, a young woman with red hair and a serious face, and she brought a message that Dot Haynes had sent. The message was simple. There was a man in town asking for Ruth. He said he was a friend. He said he had traveled a long way. And he said he had news from Missouri that she needed to hear. Ruth stood in the yard, the note in her hand, and she felt the old fear stir in her chest. But it was different now. It was not the paralyzing terror that had driven her for years. It was a smaller thing, manageable, something she could look at and acknowledge without letting it take control. She walked to the barn, where Seth was working with the new timbers, and she showed him the note. He read it, and his face went still in that way she had come to know. "I'll come with you," he said. "No," she said it firmly, surprising herself. "You need to be here. The barn won't build itself, and if there's something I need to face it on my own." She paused. "But I'll take Eli." Seth looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. "All right." She rode into town with Eli beside her, the wagon bumping over the rutted road. The prairie was healing, green shoots already pushing up through the blackened soil, and Ruth watched the land recover and felt a kinship with it. They found the man at the boarding house, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and a worn leather satchel at his feet. He was older than she had expected, white-haired and weathered, with the kind of face that had been shaped by hard work and hard weather. He stood when he saw her, and he removed his hat. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I'm Nathan Hale. I'm no relation to the lawyer, though I've met him once or twice. I'm a friend of your late husband's, or I was, before things went bad." Ruth stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I don't know you." "You wouldn't. I knew Bernard from before you married him. We ran cattle together in the early years, before he started drinking." The man's eyes were kind, but there was a sadness in them that spoke of old regrets. "I heard about his passing, and I heard about the trouble with Carter. I came to tell you something that I should have told you years ago." Ruth waited. Nathan Hale reached into his satchel and pulled out a folded document, yellowed with age, creased along lines that had been folded and refolded many times. He held it out to her. "Bernard wrote this before he married you. It's a letter to his brother Carter. He never sent it. Carter never knew it existed. But I kept it because I thought someday it might matter." Ruth took the document and unfolded it. The handwriting was Bernard's, that familiar, careless scrawl that she had seen on so many notes that came home from the saloon, asking for money, asking for forgiveness, asking for things he never intended to give. But this letter was different. It was dated a month before their wedding, and it was addressed to Carter. In it, Bernard wrote that he was planning to marry, that he was hoping to start a family, that he knew his brother had always been jealous of any happiness he found. And then, in words that made Ruth's breath catch, Bernard wrote that if anything ever happened to him, he wanted Carter to know that he trusted no one else with his wife's future. He wrote that Carter was not to interfere, not to meddle, not to claim any right to any children that might come. He wrote that if Carter ever tried to take what Bernard was building, he would rise from the grave to stop him. The letter was not a legal document. It was not witnessed or notarized. It was a letter from a man to his brother, written in the privacy of a hotel room, never sent. But it was proof of what Ruth had always suspected, that Bernard, for all his failings, had loved her in his way, that he had seen Carter clearly, that he had tried, in the only way he knew how, to protect her. Ruth read the letter twice, and then she folded it carefully and looked at Nathan Hale. "Why are you giving me this now?" "Because I heard about the hearing in Wichita. I heard about Carter trying to take your children. And I knew that if Bernard's letter had been produced, Carter would have had a harder time claiming he was acting out of brotherly concern." He shook his head slowly. "I should have brought it years ago. I'm sorry I waited." Ruth looked at the letter in her hands. It was not a weapon she would ever need now. The hearing was over, the judgment rendered, her victory complete. But it was something else. It was a piece of closure, a thread that connected the woman she had been to the woman she was becoming. "Thank you," she said. "This means more than you know." Nathan Hale nodded. "I figured it might." They sat on the porch of the boarding house, Ruth and Eli and the old cattleman, and they talked about Bernard as he had been before the drink took him. Nathan spoke of a young man with a quick smile and a talent with horses, a man who had been kind and decent before the weight of the world pressed him down. Ruth listened, and she did not feel the anger she had carried for so long. She felt something closer to sorrow, a clean, honest grief for the life that might have been. When she left, she carried the letter in her pocket, pressed against her heart. Eli walked beside her, quiet, and when they reached the wagon he said, "Mama, he did love you, in his way." She looked at her son, who had grown so much and endured so much, and she put her hand on his cheek. Yes, he did, and that matters. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the light golden and soft across the recovering prairie. When they reached the gate, Seth was waiting for them, and he saw something in Ruth's face that told him the news had not been bad. She climbed down from the wagon and walked to him. She pulled the letter from her pocket and handed it to him. He read it, and when he looked up, there was a quiet understanding in his eyes. "A letter from the dead," he said. "A letter from the past," she corrected. "Telling me it's all right to let go." He folded the letter and put it in his own pocket. "Then let's bury it, not in the ground, but in the place where we keep the things that made us who we are." She looked at him, and she thought about how far she had come since the morning she sat at his gate with her sleeping children and her $11. She thought about the fire and the barn and the new building rising from the ashes. She thought about Carter McAllister, who had tried to take everything from her and had failed. She thought about Bernard, who had loved her in the only way he knew how, and who had tried to protect her from the grave. And she thought about the man standing in front of her, solid and patient, who had opened his gate and his heart without reservation. "I'm home," she said. "I'm finally home." That night, after supper, after the children were in bed and the new barn stood silent under the stars, Ruth and Seth sat on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the first true hint of autumn, and the blackened prairie was silver in the moonlight. "The land will come back," Seth said. "It always does." "So will we." He took her hand. "We already have." They sat in silence, the quiet of two people who had been tested and had not broken. And then, from somewhere down the road, a sound reached them. Not a horse, not a wagon. Footsteps, slow and uneven, approaching through the dark. Seth's hand tightened on hers. He stood, moving to the edge of the porch, peering into the night. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man, walking with a limp, his clothes torn, and his face streaked with ash and dried blood. He stopped when he saw Seth. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. "Please," he said, "I need help," and he collapsed at the gate. Seth reached the man before Ruth could catch up, kneeling in the dust of the yard beside the crumpled figure. The man's breathing was shallow and uneven, and when Seth turned him over, the porch lantern revealed a face that made him go still. It was Carter McAllister, but not the Carter who had stood on this same porch weeks before in his fine coat and his practiced confidence. This was a man who had been broken by something far more merciless than a courtroom defeat. His clothes were scorched at the edges, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle, and his face was etched with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the mile he had just walked. Ruth came up behind Seth and looked down at the man who had tried to take her children, and for a long moment she did not speak. The night was quiet except for the rasp of Carter's breathing and the distant chirping of crickets that had returned now that the fire had passed. The smell of smoke still clung to everything, but beneath it there was the clean scent of the autumn air that was beginning to edge out the summer heat. "Help me get him inside," Seth said, and his voice was level, without judgment. Ruth did not argue. She took Carter's legs while Seth lifted him under the shoulders, and together they carried him up the porch steps and into the house. They laid him on the bench near the kitchen stove, the same bench where Annie had slept that first morning, and Ruth fetched water and clean cloths, while Seth cut away the burned sleeve of Carter's coat. Eli appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, his face hardening when he saw who it was. "Why is he here?" His voice was sharp, a blade of childhood betrayal that had not yet healed. "Because he needs help," Ruth said without looking up. She was already pressing a cloth to a cut on Carter's forehead, cleaning away the blood and ash to reveal the wound beneath. "He tried to take us. He tried to take Annie." Eli's voice cracked. "He's not worth helping." Ruth stopped her work and turned to face her son. She looked at him for a long, steady moment, and then she said, "Eli, I spent 12 years learning to hate. I learned to measure every kindness for its hidden price. I learned to keep my heart small so it couldn't be broken again. And then I came here, and I found that the only way to heal was to let that small heart grow." She reached out and took his hand. "I'm not helping Carter because he deserves it. I'm helping him because I deserve to be the kind of woman who doesn't let hate rule her. And you deserve to be the kind of man who chooses mercy over revenge." Eli looked at her, and the anger in his face warred with something deeper, something that had been planted in him during those long months on the road when his mother had been the only steady thing in his world. Finally, he walked to the stove and picked up the kettle. "I'll boil water," he said, and Ruth knew that he understood. Carter came to consciousness an hour later, his eyes fluttering open to the unfamiliar ceiling of the ranch house kitchen. He turned his head and saw Ruth sitting at the table, a cup of cold coffee in front of her, watching him with eyes that held neither warmth nor hostility. "Where am I?" His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "My kitchen," Ruth said. "You collapsed at the gate." Carter tried to sit up, but his arm sent a spike of pain through him, and he fell back with a groan. "You should have let me lie there." "Probably," Ruth's voice was flat, "but I'm not in the business of becoming what you are." Carter closed his eyes. "I lost everything. The fire took my horse, my money, everything I had left. I've been walking for 2 days. I didn't know where else to go." Ruth did not respond immediately. She looked at the man who had been her adversary, reduced now to a broken figure on her bench, and she searched herself for the satisfaction she had expected to feel. It was not there. Instead, there was a quiet sadness, a recognition that the cost of his obsession had been as high for him as it had almost been for her. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "Because I had nowhere else," his voice wavered. "Because I realized, somewhere out there in the smoke, that I had spent so long trying to take something from you that I had lost everything of my own. I don't have a wife. I don't have children. I don't have anyone who would look for me if I died in a ditch." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "You have a family, Ruth. You have a man who would walk into a burning barn for you. I came here because I wanted to see what that looked like, up close, before I leave this world for good." Seth, who had been standing in the doorway to the back room, stepped into the light. "You're not leaving this world tonight. You're going to rest, eat something, and in the morning we'll figure out what to do with you." Carter looked at him, and there was no defiance left in his eyes. "Why? Why would you help me after everything I tried to do?" Seth looked at Ruth. She nodded almost imperceptibly. "Because my wife is teaching me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he does to his enemies, but by what he does for those who can do nothing for him. You're helpless, Carter, and I can't turn away a helpless man." The kitchen fell silent. Carter's face worked through a series of emotions that were too quick to name, and then he turned his head away, and his shoulders shook with something that might have been sobbing, or might have been the release of a tension he had carried for years. Ruth stood and walked to the stove. "Eli, bring me the broth from the cold box, and fetch a blanket from my room." She did not look at Carter, but her voice was steady. "You'll sleep here tonight. In the morning we'll see." The night passed without incident. Carter slept on the bench, his broken arm splinted and wrapped, his face slack with a rest that looked more like surrender than peace. Ruth and Seth sat in their room, talking in low voices about what the morning would bring. "He's not going to give up," Seth said. "I think he already has." Ruth leaned against the headboard, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "I saw it in his eyes. The fight is gone. All that's left is a man who doesn't know what to do with himself. Can he be trusted? I don't know, but I don't think he's a threat anymore." She looked at Seth. "And I think sending him away without help would be worse than keeping him close and watching him." Seth was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're a better woman than I am." "No," she said. "I'm a woman who's been given a second chance, and I want to make sure I use it right." The next morning the sun rose clear and cold, the first true autumn day. The prairie was still blackened in places, but the green shoots were more visible now, pushing through the ash with the stubbornness of life that refused to be defeated. Carter woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. He sat up slowly, testing his arm, finding that it had been set properly and bound with clean cloth. Ruth was at the stove, and Annie was sitting at the table, watching him with the unblinking curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of him. Eli stood by the door, arms crossed, his face guarded. "Morning," Carter said, and his voice was hoarse but steadier than the night before. Ruth set a plate of food on the table in front of him. "Eat!" He looked at the food, then at her. "Why?" "I already told you. We don't turn away helpless men." He picked up the fork and took a bite, and then he ate the rest of it without stopping, as if he had forgotten what it felt like to be full. When he finished, he set the fork down and looked at Ruth. "I don't know how to thank you." "Then don't." She sat down across from him. "You can thank me by leaving here and not coming back. Go find something worth putting your energy into. Build something, fail at it, build something else. But don't spend the rest of your life chasing a loss that doesn't belong to you." Carter looked at her, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I had a wife once," he said quietly. "She left me, said I was cold, said I cared more about appearances than about her. I never learned how to love anything without wanting to own it." He looked down at his hands. "I see now that I was trying to own your children the same way, because I didn't know how else to hold on to something." Ruth did not soften. She did not reach out to comfort him, but she did not look away either. "It's not too late to learn." He nodded slowly, and then he stood, holding his injured arm close to his chest, and walked to the door. At the threshold he turned. "I'll sign whatever papers you need. I'll never come back to Kansas. You have my word." Ruth looked at Seth, who was standing in the kitchen doorway watching. He nodded once. "Go in peace, Carter," Ruth said, and Carter McAllister walked out of the house, down the lane, and out of their lives. The ranch settled into the rhythm of autumn. The new barn was finished, its timbers still fragrant with fresh wood, and the first frost came in mid-October, dusting the prairie with silver. The cattle were brought in from the east pasture, and the hay was stacked high against the coming winter. Eli had grown another inch, and he had taken to sitting with Seth at the supper table, discussing the affairs of the ranch with a seriousness that made Ruth's heart ache with pride. He was becoming a man, not because he had been forced to, but because he had been given the space to grow at his own pace. Annie had started school, and she came home every day with stories that spilled out of her in a rush, about Miss Cartwright and the blacksmith's daughter, and a stray dog that had been hanging around the schoolyard. She had taken to calling Seth Papa when she thought no one was listening, and Ruth had seen the look on Seth's face the first time he heard it, a look that was equal parts joy and wonder. One evening, when the children were in bed and the fire crackled in the hearth, Ruth sat on the porch with Seth, wrapped in a blanket against the chill. The stars were out, sharp and bright, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and dry leaves. "The land is healing," Seth said, gesturing toward the prairie where the grass was growing back thick and green. "People heal too," Ruth said. She leaned against him. "I had forgotten what that felt like." Seth wrapped his arm around her. "We've got a long winter ahead. It'll test us. But I think we're ready." "We're ready," she said. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his face was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I love you, Ruth Calloway." "And I love you, Seth Calloway." They sat on the porch of the ranch that had become a home, and they watched the stars wheel overhead. And they knew, with a certainty that went deeper than words, that they had built something worth keeping. The next morning, Ruth woke to the sound of Annie's laughter drifting in from the yard. She rose and dressed and walked to the window, and she saw Eli and Annie chasing each other through the grass that was no longer black, but a bright, hopeful green. Seth was at the barn, harnessing the horses for the day's work, and he looked up and saw her in the window and raised his hand in a wave. She waved back, and she felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. She had come to this place with $11 and a broken heart, and she had found a man who opened his gate without hesitation, a son who had learned to trust again, a daughter who had stopped being afraid, and a home that was not just a house, but a sanctuary. She went downstairs and started the coffee, and when Seth came in from the barn, she handed him a cup, and he took it, and his fingers brushed hers, and the gesture was so ordinary and so profound that she felt tears prick at her eyes. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He smiled, that slow, rare smile that she had come to treasure. "Good," he said. "Let's keep it that way." And they did. They worked through the autumn and into the winter, through the snows and the cold and the long nights when the wind howled around the corners of the house, and the fire was the only light for miles. They told stories and sang songs and taught Annie to read, and watched Eli become the kind of man any father would be proud of. And at night, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Ruth and Seth would sit by the fire and talk about nothing and everything, and the silence between them was not empty, but full of the things they no longer needed to say. On Christmas morning, Ruth woke to find a small box on the kitchen table, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine. Inside was a ring, simple and silver, engraved with a pattern of wheat sheaves. A note beside it read, "For the woman who taught me that the best things in life are worth waiting for. Merry Christmas, Seth." She put the ring on her finger and walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling, soft and steady, covering the prairie in a blanket of white. The new barn stood solid against the storm, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight into the gray sky. Eli and Annie were outside, building a snowman with a lopsided hat and a carrot nose, and Seth was standing by the fence, watching them, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold, and he turned and saw her and smiled. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Calloway." "Merry Christmas, Mr. Calloway." She walked to him and slipped her hand into his, and they stood together, watching the snow fall on the land that had tested them and refined them and given them a home. The prairie asked for everything a person had to give, and in return, it gave them back to each other. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.